So moving on today, inshallah, we'd like to touch upon a few different verses that regard Amirul Mu'mineen within the glorious Quran. Now there's a concept that we have which is called Tawassul. Now Tawassul means to get nearness to someone, to get closer to somebody. How? By using a means of approach. That means of approach that you use, that is called Tawassul, that is intercession. Now unfortunately, the Shias have been labeled by the other sects within Islam, where they say that the Shias invoke other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in fact, the Shias, they like to say, commit shirk by going to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said many times within the glorious Quran, ask me, and I will give you. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am closer to you than your jugular vein. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, call on me, and when you are in your sujood, I am close to you and I will answer any dua that you have. So you've got all these verses in the Quran on the one side that say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, invoke me. In fact, even within Surah Al-Fatiha, what do we say? إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone we worship and you alone we seek help from. So in a way, when they come forward with this opinion and they try to deceive people on the concept of tawassul, a lot of people unfortunately fall into that trap. Because if you were to present these verses to somebody that has not studied Islam, and if you were to present these as evidences against tawassul, the common Muslim would be like, well, yep, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said it in black and white. Ask me. Don't ask anyone else. Don't invoke anyone else. I am your creator. I am closer to you than your jugular vein. So that's one opinion that has come forward. Now there's no doubt that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will answer our prayers. And there is no doubt that if you were to invoke Allah directly, He will answer your prayer, no doubt. But when it comes to tawassul and intercession, what we have to realize is, I'll give you an example that we can understand. If you want to go towards a king, can you just randomly go in and meet him? Can you randomly just walk into his residence and just forget the kings? Let's look at today's time. If you wanted to see the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I know it's changed now, but if you wanted to see the Prime Minister, can you just walk in normally and be like, I want to have a discussion with you? No. Why? Because his station is higher than yours. His position and authority is higher than yours. Therefore, you need to, how can you get towards the Prime Minister, for example? You need to seek a means of approach, don't you? You need to go through someone. Who? Someone that's close to the Prime Minister. And depends on whoever is the most closest will be able to get you towards your end destination. If you wanted to see the President, for example, you would have to go through the people who are close to him. Coming back to the example of the king, if you wanted to have an audience with a king, you can't just walk in. In fact, you have to ask permission and you have to seek all these different means to get to him until one person says, I know the king, I will take you towards the king. Again, what's the caveat? The person has to be close to whatever it is you are trying to get close to. Now you want to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who's the closest? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who's the greatest creation? None other than our holy Prophet, Hazrat Mohammed sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Nobody is greater in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala other than him firstly. So it would make more sense that if you wanted to get a dua answered, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you use a means. And we get another safarish karte. Like we're all Pakistani. You know that in Pakistan, for example, if you want something done, you always use someone who has a position or someone who has authority. For example, you say, you know there's a lot of corruption in Pakistan, but for example, you would say, why? Why don't you go directly to the source? Why? Because the person who is closer to the source than you have more chances of that person listening to him than listening to you. We're fallible human beings. We live our life in such a way where we commit sins, we make mistakes, we make errors, we disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we raise our hands in dua, would you be surprised if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't respond back to us? Or He delays our duas being answered? How many times has it been that you've asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something and you've prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and many years have gone by and that dua still hasn't been answered? The The reason why these du'as are not being answered is because our deeds are blocking our du'as reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our actions, the way we live our life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated in the Quran, I have not created the humans and the jinns except that they worship me. There you go, that's your sole purpose. Your purpose in coming into this world is not to earn a living. Your purpose isn't to be known and well famous within the community, for example. Your purpose is not to have friends. Your purpose is not to live a healthy and comfortable life. Yes, those things matter. Islam doesn't say live as a poor person. Islam says if you can earn money, you earn that money. Islam says if you earn money, you have the right to spend that money. Nowhere does Islam say that you have to live in a poor, oppressive way. However, how do you get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the question. He said, you have been created to worship me. So when you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will listen to you, very simple. However, if you don't worship Him the way He has asked you to worship Him, then you wouldn't be surprised if your du'as are not being answered. Therefore, we need to find a means of getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as I said, the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the final messenger. So the Prophet is the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first dalil is Sidratul Muntaha. After the Prophet, the second closest is who? Amirul Mu'mineen. Why? As we said before, the Quran in chapter 3 verse 61 says what? Anfusana wa anfusakum. The nafs of the Prophet is Amirul Mu'mineen. Just like that, they were created from what? The same light. They were created 10,000 years before the creation of Adam alayhi salam. The holy five were created, as we said in Hadith al-Qisa, before anything was created. So we've established in order to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, we can go directly towards it. Of course we can. But if you feel that your dua is not being answered, then there are other ways of getting towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is where tawassul comes in.